I want to tee up an exciting agenda here. We have a bunch of case studies, very important areas, and these case studies are they're kind of backbone models that have been used and adapted in many, many contexts. So like the basic repertory of most seasoned decision professionals will include these case studies or some variation of it. Now, first up, we have a man who has a superpower. And I think each of you has a superpower too, by the way, and I'm very curious of knowing what it is. But Tom's superpower is that he can take a complicated problem and he starts digging around the edges, and then he uproots the trees and he pulls the weeds, and pretty soon you've got a big hole, and then there's a foundation, and then you think it's a one-story house, and then it's a two-story house, and pretty soon he's built a skyscraper and he has completely nailed it. Maybe he's over-nailed it sometimes, but he's done this in many, many areas, and I've had the great privilege of working with him, and one of the things I do is I steal from others. So when I see a superpower, I don't imitate it, but I try to be inspired by it. Like, how can I Tom this one? And one of the things he's most famous and well known for is really a case study that put portfolio management on the map. It ended up in a Harvard Business case study and initiated, essentially, the pharmaceutical industry taking decision professionals seriously and building up decision professional organizations. So we're going to hear this story from the man himself, Tom Keelin.
Thank you, David. That's a fun introduction. Much appreciated. Okay, so the story I'm going to tell is actually from 30 years ago, but it turned out to be one of the most impactful decision analysis projects on which I've ever worked, really. And it's more than just decision analysis, as you'll see. It's portfolio management, but also the soft side of building trust and credibility, not just the hard side of analyzing numbers. So let's take a little bit of a look, and I'm going to just give you some of the key background here before I jump into the case study itself. The client organization was SmithKline Beecham Pharmaceuticals, May to October 1995. That was the key portfolio prioritization project, and then that was followed by a year of SmithKline Beecham saying, gee, that was really good. Would you help train our people and help us implement that process inside our own organization? And that was followed by a wave of pharmaceutical companies across the industry doing exactly the same thing. And then it leaked over into oil and gas, wanting to adopt these methods and so forth. But there's quite a lot here that is quite, that was unique at the time. The direct clients there were the late Dr. Paul Nicholson, who was the worldwide head of development for SmithKline Beecham, and Dr. J.P. Garnier, who at that time was the COO of SmithKline Beecham, but later, after the merger with Glaxo, he became CEO of the merged entity, GlaxoSmithKline. The need was, the client need was decision quality and allocating resources across late-stage development portfolio, and late stage meant phase 2 or later. And that portfolio consisted of 20 projects across 4 therapeutic areas, across originally 2 continents, UK and US, if you call those continents, and then later in Japan. So this is a worldwide project. The project team, as you can see here, and I'm not going to read all the names, we had an extraordinary project team. The result of this project would never have been what it was were it not for the skills, capabilities, and contributions of this project team. 3 of these people on this list are here today, and I don't know if they're in the room with us, but William Leaf Herman was part of the project team, Troy Helm was part of the project team, and also was Yang Tao. So if you have further questions about it, you can ask them when you see them around the room. Another acknowledgement, Sandy Roble is the project leader. She's not here. She's an SDP fellow, not able to make this conference. Did an extraordinary job of managing a client team, or managing our project team, plus 20 client teams around the world, strained by a situation where they didn't trust each other because they were competing for resources. And this was all before the days of Zoom. You know, how do you get around to all these places? How do you communicate with all these people? How do you build trust? So we'll hear more about that. Ultimately, there was a Harvard Business Review article. The client came back a year after and said, hey, Tom, that was really good. We ought to make this public with an article. That ultimately became one of the most widely distributed and reprinted Harvard Business Review articles of all time. And it was that article, actually, that stimulated the whole industry-wide adoption. So it's not just that a good job happened for the client. That happens so many times in our business, but those results are kept confidential inside client organizations. This time it was made public, and that was one of the big differences. Okay, so let's dive in to what actually happened. These are the original slides from 20 years ago. I haven't modified them at all. So here we go. And some of them are not relevant, so I'm going to skip over them. It's also too long, so I'm going to skip over a number of them. A key feature of this, however, is that SB's resource allocation problem was much like that faced by many large businesses. That's why the methods ultimately became so popular. You had a portfolio of business or complex projects that require risky investments. The businesses are technically complex, interdependent, face significant competition. This is a crucial point, number 3 here. The information that you need to allocate resources across these projects resides primarily with the business area champions. The people in the project that are competing for the resources are also the people that know the most about the project. That creates a huge built-in motivational bias that you have to be able to get around it somehow. And the resource allocation process is strained by the difficulty of communications, organizational cynicism, and people, they had been at this for years and not been able to find a good solution to it. People would say things cynically like your business area is as good as the performance you can put on at funding time. If you can jump up and down and raise your hands and create lots of emotion, and people say, oh, well, I guess that project has to have some resources, right? So big challenges in that regard. They had tried, they actually thought the problem was becoming more acute. They had had this problem for years, but as they said, well, we're living through an industrial revolution in biology. They're tightening resource constraints. One of the key people, this is Dr. Garnier actually, said, you know, the development portfolio has to be cut back. We can't put the funding into it that we were expecting to put into it. And your job, Tom, SDG team, is to tell us where we should cut. And that was kind of the beginning of the project. So they had tried a lot of things previously. I'm not going to go over these, but none of them had worked. Top management call the shots, that's one way, but they can't get buy-in that way. Decide behind closed doors, also they can't get buy-in. The decisions would get recycled. Peer review and consensus, it didn't work. A lot of championing and posturing going on. Outside portfolio, they had hired another major consulting firm, I think, whose name begins with an M. And that consulting firm had said, this is what you should do. It completely flopped because the people in control of these projects and therapeutic areas didn't believe the analysis. They just didn't believe the recommendations. So we had to get, and they had tried lots of technologies too, prioritizing by show of hands. They had tried multi-attribute. They hated net present value analysis because they had different people in different parts of the organization doing net present value analysis on the same projects based on different assumptions, based on not credible information. And finally, senior management just said, inconsistent analyses are worse than none. I'd rather have no analyses than inconsistent ones. So garbage in, garbage out, and so forth. All right, so a real key to this project is that we were looking to help them find a technically sound compass. In other words, what's the direction of true north in terms of increasing shareholder value, but at the same time, understanding that this is a organizationally complex issue, and there's a whole soft side to how do you deal effectively inside a large organization that if we hadn't really worked hard dealing with that, the good outcomes of this project simply would not have happened. Okay, so let's get into the meat of it. The meat of it is that one of the aspects of the meet is one of the things that was new in this project was the idea that we weren't just going to analyze a single momentum strategy. Every project had a momentum strategy, and it had a sort of a built-in trajectory of how it would be funded this year and next year and the next year and so forth. Well, every project has one of those, but we built into this the idea that you could actually have a so-called buy-down strategy, which meant, you know, that you have a current momentum strategy. Here you are. This was an example project out of the oncology therapeutic area where he had a project that had two. Here's where it lists where it was on expected remaining development costs. That's the cost side versus shareholder value creation. That's probability weighted net present value looking forward. And here's where this project was. That's its current plan. Okay. Our previous R&D efforts that had just looked at the current plan for every project in the portfolio and sort of listed projects in order of greatest value to least value really didn't have much impact on decision making because nobody was going to stop the projects. It was just sort of interesting information. Here, based on, I could tell a story, but I'm not going to tell. For lack of time, I just want to say here, before the project started, we ended up looking at why the previous projects had gone wrong, ended up concluding that we needed some alternatives for each project, like, for example, a buy-down alternative. And so that would be something like this. What if less resources were available and there wasn't enough resource to do the current plan? What would you do and still preserve the most value? And the answer in this case was they would cut back on the oral form of tumor type B. Okay, and the project team worked through that. Now there's a buy-up question too. What if expanded resources were available for your project? Very reasonable question. How could you apply those additional resources to the highest value? And what the team ultimately came up with is, you know, what would we do? We'd add an IV form for a tumor type C there that's covered up by the arrow. But what was interesting about that is, look, they increased costs by $5 million expected. They increased the benefit in terms of shareholder value from here, $400 million, to $500 million. They increased value by $100 million, shareholder value for the company, by spending an extra $5 million. And somebody says that is a massive increase in value for a relatively small increase in cost. And then someone else on the project team said, well, we had no idea that tumor type C is so valuable. And that gave them a new idea. And the new idea was, well, wait a minute. If tumor type C is so valuable, there's another alternative here. We could cut back on the oral form for tumor types A and B, and that would enable us to fund the IV form for tumor type C. And now look at what we've got. We've got a new buy-down alternative, which actually is almost exactly the same cost as the original buy-down alternative, but far more valuable. Well, this is an extreme example. For most of the projects in the portfolio, you just ended up with, you know, buy-down, current momentum, and buy-up. But on this particular one, they came up with another idea, a creative idea, which was far, far better than any of the others, and they ended up submitting this idea 4 into the process. So now, let's talk about the results of the analysis. And there's a lot of steps in between here. We did a real decision analysis with decision trees and tornado diagrams with each project team on each of those 4 alternatives. In between, there were management reviews, there were peer reviews. Each therapeutic area got to look at the data on which these analyses were based by all the other therapeutic areas. They got to ask questions of their peers. The pressure of these cross-functional reviews with all the people competing for information or competing for resources in the same room, which is they actually began to build trust that the assumptions that the other teams and other therapeutic areas were reasonable. All this was absolutely critical to get up to a final meeting where this was one of the key charts that was presented. And so what we have here is we have all those dots. Every a portfolio that SmithKline Beecham could have chosen. Okay, and what are all those portfolios? Well, there are 20 projects. There are 4 alternatives. There's also a stop alternative for each project. There are 20 projects. There are 80 alternatives in total. And if you looked at what are all the combinations, if you picked one alternative for each of the 20 projects and you did all possible combinations of that, the number is over 10 to the 12th possible choices. Well, if you just did a random sample of the projects, you get this cloud right here. That's cool. And what it showed, and this is the current momentum for each project. So if you just put the current momentum strategy for each project, and that's the highest value for money, second highest value, you line up the 20 projects, you get out to here. Okay? Well, what's interesting about that from top management perspective is, well, that means our current momentum plans are probably better than about 80% or more of the portfolios we could have chosen. And they felt pretty good about that, given that they felt that their resource allocation process was not as good as it could be or should be. However, if you ask the question, what is the highest value possible portfolio for the same budget? My goodness, look, there's a point way up here. Oops, sorry. There's a point way up here. And now here's a point where, in terms of probability weighted, future looking, shareholder value, net present value, you've got $2 billion more value for the same budget. Not even increasing budget at all. This was a massive result. So now the next key questions, building to some on David's presentation from across the way earlier this morning, is, well, 2 questions. What does that highest value portfolio consist of? In other words, what set of decisions would you make if you were going to implement that, number 1? And then number 2, would the organization really buy into it? That's where it had all gone south before. You come up with some better idea, and powerful people in the organization won't buy into it. So what happened? Well, first what happened is we were very clear, and these are the actual projects, except we've code-named them for confidentiality purposes, but it turned out that highest value point there consisted of doing a buy-up, allocating more resources to 10 of the 20 projects, staying with current resources for 4 of them, and doing buy-down or minimal on the remaining 6. And it's the remaining 6, the cutbacks, that would fund, and everything in yellow here is an additional program that was funded. You're not going to just go for migraine, you're going to go for acute migraine. You're not just going to go asthma, you're going to go for a combination therapy. All these are things that cost additional money, but we're very specific about what all those alternatives consisted of. There were certain programs not funded and so forth. So that was the highest value point. Next question, could the organization or would the organization adopt it? And the answer to that came about in a critical meeting where basically people, all of the key therapy areas, project heads, the most powerful people in the organization came together in a meeting in a room in London. The leader of that meeting was Dr. Paul Nicholson, the worldwide head of development at the time. And he, after the results were all presented and so forth, the room was pretty quiet. You could hear a pin drop, really, because nobody really knew what was going to happen. Dr. Nicholson went down. He said, okay, he says, how many of you for this first project are going to buy up? Does anybody objects to that? Nope. He went right down the list. The second project, we're going to buy up. We're going to do this. Does anybody object? No. No objection. He went right down, and he got through all of the he got through the buy-up and the current momentum, no objections. Then he said, do we also agree that to cut back on Project Oscar? Okay, at that point, I remember this so distinctly, the therapy area champion for Project Oscar stood up, and he is one of the most powerful people in the organization, and his voice in such meetings had always been the one that carried the day before. And he said, no, we should not cut back on Project Oscar. This pilot project is extremely valuable to the company, and here are all the reasons. And he listed out reason after reason after reason. Dr. Nicholson listened to this and said, okay, Bill, is there anything about what you have just told us that has not been captured in the process and analysis up to this point? And Bill said, No, I think it's all been captured, but I just want to let you know, I want to make sure you all know how valuable this project is to us. At which point Dr. Nicholson said, well, we agree that Project Oscar is valuable, but we have learned from this resource that we have more valuable uses. We've learned from this effort that we have more valuable uses for the same resource. It was a stunning statement. Bill sat down. It was quiet. This had never happened before inside SmithKline Beecham. Okay? And it ended this potentially exclusive discussion. The other buy-down and minimal alternatives were discussed and soon agreed. So they had a plan, and they were going to do this plan. That was what they were expecting to do. Well, then it goes up to the level, well, first of all, the characteristics of this are such that if you looked at how many shareholder value dollars are being produced on the margin by the last project, the least improving, you were getting about a 5-to-1 margin on the current portfolio, the marginal value on the last project. But with this more powerful, better set of alternatives that have been created during the project, they were getting 15-to-1 shareholder value for the last dollar invested. Well, that's an astonishing number, because that's a big number. You know, can you really afford, or do you really not want to undertake a project that's yielding 15-to-1 shareholder dollars per dollar invested? And you go all the way out here. Well, it turned out that when you took this up to the level of Dr. Garnier, the COO, and Jan Leschly, who was the CEO at the time, all of a sudden they realized that actually R&D was far more productive than what they were imagining before this project happened. And the result of that is ultimately they decided, rather than increase budget for sales and marketing, which was their original plan when they said, Tom, your job is to tell us how to cut back on the portfolio, instead of that, they ended up actually increasing the development budget by more than 50%, and that added another $0.6 billion in shareholder value. And what they ultimately ended up adopting, as documented in the HBR article, is that point there on the far right. So it was a blockbuster inside the company. Eventually they went public with this statement. This came from Paul Sharp, head of the CNS therapeutic area. In the end, we estimated our portfolio was worth $2.6 billion more than when we started. Powerful confirmation our efforts are worthwhile. So, what were the key ingredients to that success? We did some analysis at the time. We showed that actually the SDG clients that were implementing stuff like this, their stock prices were going up faster than other clients that weren't. And it's amazing that you can actually do a project where you actually have a reasonable belief you can trace it to effects on stock price. That doesn't happen very often in our profession. We're fortunate to be in the opportunity to have the opportunity to do that at this time. It wasn't just a financial benefit, and this is probably worth pointing out. What they got out of it, in their view, is a commonly shared philosophy, language, and framework, results that were clear and credible across functions, tangible, credible evidence that resources were being spread too thin. As a general principle, if you have a politically oriented resource allocation process without any good quality, what's the direction of true north, resources get spread too thin because they want to give something to everybody. And this was a powerful combination, or powerful proof that that's what had happened was happening prior to this effort. Improved cross-functional communication and so forth. So there was, one of my favorite diagrams from the time is what were the ingredients of success that made this happen? And the key ingredients are listed here. And there's a chain there. And what this chain shows is if any one of the links in the chain is broken, this higher value-added curve would flop back down to the current momentum curve. It would just all go away. You had to have committed organizational leadership. Dr. Nicholson had to take the powerful stance he did take. You had to have a credible valuation methodology, and you had to build that in with credible information. You had to have a range of investment alternatives. good facilitation. People didn't know how to work through it. You had to help them work through it, help them understand it, help them believe that what they were doing. You had to have a good process design, effective leadership, and workable supporting systems. So at that point, I could go on and on here, but this is a synopsis of what ultimately went into the Harvard Business Review articles and then got adopted across not only pharmaceuticals, but oil and gas, multiple other industries. And I'm going to stop there and take any questions. Yeah, well, the credible valuation methodology started by us doing a demonstration project. They brought us in and had it work on one specific project. And then they asked us to do a top management seminar. Decision quality was hot at the time. They really believed they needed decision quality. We did a top management seminar where we went through all the principles of decision analysis and decision quality and then used this particular example project as an example, and that helped them buy in, okay? And then after they bought in and decided that they were willing to trust us, and there's a huge amount of trust involved for a pharmaceutical company to bring a consultant in to look at its crown jewels, basically. Then it was our job to design a process that would make it credible, and most especially the cross-functional peer review before we did any analysis. This is what all the alternatives are for every project. This is how those alternatives look when you look at the buy up, the buy down, and so forth. So there was a lot of built-in communication to build credibility and trust. Question? Yes? The efficient frontier is the best set of alternatives constrained by a budget. So if you had a very small budget, you'd be at the far left end of it, and the larger your budget you have, the farther out you move, and it's constructed based on the highest value for incremental investment. Yes, we considered all those 10 to the 12th possible combinations and worked through it in a systematic way that allowed us to come up with what was the highest value portfolio of the 10 to the 12th possible combinations. Oh, right. Oh, no. Yeah. We had a step-by-step incremental investment for money algorithm that got to the highest value portfolio. Yes.
How did you eliminate bias in this valuation methodology?
We eliminated biases by using a lot of industry benchmarks. For example, the biggest bias is probability of success. Teams always think their project has a higher probability of success than it really does. We used all the available industry benchmarks at the time. In order to, if something has a 2/3 probability of success in phase 3 and the team was saying it's got an 80% probability, they had to give reasons why their project was different from the industry averages. And that led to a lot of reasonable calibration and trust. We also, as a consulting team, had to use our experience having worked with other pharmaceutical companies, not revealing confidential information, but saying, this kind of an estimate is out of line with our experience. What's your rationale for it? That's how we got to, we combined our experience with theirs. Is there time for one more, David, or not? Okay. We tried to do that. It's actually very hard as projects evolve in an organization, and as even that shareholder value graph. We kept track of that for a few years, but then Glaxo merged with SmithKline. All of a sudden, there's just too much noise, too many other variables. So, the basic principle is, you've got to do the best thing you can based on all the information and alternatives you've got. Yes. Oh, yes.
Happy news, we're still using efficient frontier. In every single portfolio investment decision, the first 10 to 15 minutes, we look at efficient frontier together with all the portfolio context to put the investment decision in context.
Yes. That,
So my question to you is really, I guess for this one is for more late stage assets when you have
yes.
plausible.
It was phase two and later, yeah.
So for the earlier stage one, how do we ensure the principle also applies to the early stage assets?
It's much harder. It's much harder. The earlier you get, the less you can focus on a particular molecule, and the more you have to focus on a particular therapy area or a particular series of molecules. We did develop, with various projects, ways of looking at the earlier stage portfolio, but it's just beyond the scope of what I can address right here in my remaining second. Thank you so much for your question. Yeah.